how do I use my knowledge of a range of strategies, and how do I use my knowledge of a task to purposefully direct my thinking and to monitor my thinking to support success with that task.
It's really concrete. You know, these are terms that we can use as teachers and in classrooms to support pupils in developing certain approaches. You know, I think probably, you know, obviously you guys have been in the game for a while. We would have called this independence back in the day, but unhelpfully so, because, well, what does that really mean?
You know, metacognitive strategies help writing become more transparent, more accessible, and help pupils get a sense of control over that process.
Reluctance in writing is a very special kind of beast, isn't it? I think it's particularly frustrating both for probably the learner and the teacher. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Jen Sutherland and Donny Morrison as we explore metacognition in writing and what that might mean for our practice in school and, in particular, the classroom. Now, Jen and Donny were very kind in donating a session for our TDAPE online conference. Tickets can be found via the link in the description. We've got sessions from Rachel Ball and Elliot Hahn, Am Colbeck, Stuart Welsh, Matt Hinckley, Katie Morrill, Jason Amu-Gottfried, Donny Morrison, Jen Sutherland, and we've got more on the way in. So if you are interested in online and on-demand professional development opportunities, click the link, go to the Eventbrite, and you'll be given access to all of those and anything that we add to the page over the next 12 months. So without further ado, let's get straight into today's episode. Jen and Donny, it's lovely to see you today. How are you both?
We are great, thank you.
Great, Kieran. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
No, my pleasure. So obviously you guys have spoken at a couple of TDAPE conferences, and we've been sort of talking about we're going to have this conversation for a while. And so it's really good to finally find the time to do so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Kieran.
I mean, as it's your first time, I thought it probably makes sense for us to start with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
Yeah, hi, so my name's Jen Sutherland, and I am a primary teacher. I am co-director of Illuminating Literacy with Donny, and I am also a teaching and learning and literacy consultant. So I've been in primary education for about coming up to 18 years now. I spent the bulk of that in schools as a primary teacher, English lead and senior leader. I then spent some time in teacher education and in school development, before I then moved into teaching and learning consultancy and literacy consultancy. So I sort of divide my time now between working on luminary literacy and supporting schools sort of across the country with teaching and learning expertise, developing teaching and learning and literacy expertise. But also I spend every Thursday and Friday with a brilliant bunch of Year 5 children down in South London who very much keep me on my toes. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself, my background, Kieran.
And for me, similar to Jen, I've been, must be now, similar 18, coming up to 18 years in education. Big chunk of that has been as a primary school teacher. I've been lucky enough to teach in all key stages, including early years. I've worked as a English subject lead, senior leader, key stage leader. And for the last good chunk, I've been working as a literacy consultant, doing lots of traveling, and working with teachers, with a particular passion for literacy curriculum design and pedagogy. So excited to be here.
You guys, you were working together for a company, and you decided you're actually going to go be brave and go out on your own and try and help schools.
That's it. Oh, I should have added as well, I'm also co-director of luminary literacy too.
Yes, like Kieran,
yes, and that's
quite a new company. We're really excited about it. We're all about sort of expert literacy support for primary schools with a particular focus on writing. So our sort of evidence-informed and sequence writing curriculum is a big arm of kind of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I mean, like, reading and writing are always of great interest to the TDAPE audience. Everyone always really keen to learn more, because it's one of those ones where you need a lot of specialist knowledge to support pupils with one of the most difficult things that they'll possibly encounter. And we're going to focus on writing as opposed to the whole of literacy, because I know that that's very broad. And like you rightly said, Jim, when you were talking, one episode is not it does not a conversation about literacy make. So we'll maybe cover that over the next couple of years or so. I reckon.
Yeah, part 2 at some point, perhaps. Yeah,
I love a part 2. Yeah, because I always come back to things over an extended period of time and see how things, and then we almost got this big sort of ethnographic record. But we're going to look at metacognition in writing, and it always makes sense to start with definitions. What do we mean when we say metacognition in writing?
Yeah, and I suppose it would probably make even more sense to just zoom out even further for a moment and just talk about metacognition and cognition more generally, and then zoom back in and talk about metacognition in writing. And I think whenever we talk about metacognition and cognition in training, we tend to draw a lot on the EEF metacognition and self-regulated learning guidance report. That tends to be really useful in terms of making what could be two potentially quite complex concepts that little bit more accessible for teachers and leaders. And so if we think about cognition, using the definition from that report, cognition is all about the knowledge of the content and the concepts required to be successful with a specific task. So in literacy, this might be knowledge of how an adjective functions and basic knowledge of how to use an adjective to modify a noun. Or it might be knowledge of the function of an adverbial, and it might be the knowledge of how to use an adverbial to extend or to expand a clause to add some detail. So that will be the cognition side of things. Then we've got the metacognition, which goes beyond what do I know and need to be able to do. And it goes into how do I use my knowledge of myself as a learner? How do I use my knowledge of a range of strategies? And how do I use my knowledge of a task to purposefully direct my thinking and to monitor my thinking to support success with that task? And those metacognitive strategies tend to fall broadly into 3 categories of planning, monitoring, and evaluating. So how do I plan and monitor and evaluate my thinking to support myself to be successful with a task? But then if we sort of really zoom in and we bring that into the context of writing specifically, some metacognitive strategies in writing might be, and there are many, writing is full of metacognitive strategies, but I'll try to outline, I'll go for 5 key strategies here. So one metacognitive strategy in writing might be just generating ideas for writing in the first place. So coming up with things to write about. And we know that real life writers, when they get going with writing, they will draw on a whole range of sources when they're coming up with ideas for writing. So they will draw on their life experience. They might think about events that they've lived through. They might think about places that they've been to or conversations that they've had. But they also might draw upon books that they've read or films or TV that they've seen or even games that they've played. And they might draw upon that whole range of sort of sources to help them to generate those ideas for writing. And that would be a metacognitive strategy, because it is somebody planning their thinking to support them to be successful with a task. And I think that links quite nicely into just planning more generally as a metacognitive strategy, because there are so many ways to plan for writing. You might plan through talk, you might plan through drawing pictures, you might plan through play. You might plan through you might plan through discussion, you might plan through drama, you might plan through words and phrases. And then if you're planning through words and phrases, you might also go into bullet points and organizational devices and things like that as well. Mm-hmm. There are so many different strategies and ways that you could use to plan a piece of writing. And again, that is all a metacognitive strategy. Another key metacognitive strategy in writing would actually just be turning your thoughts into words and sentences and into paragraphs that sort of function for the reader. So we might have a thought in our head of what it is that we want to write about, but are we able to turn that into a functioning sentence or actually into a sequence of cohesive and coherent sentences to form a paragraph? And oral composition can often be a really important part of that. Or we might also have that kind of rehearsal that we have on a whiteboard as well, where we sometimes rehearse a sentence or a paragraph before we commit it to paper. And again, that's all part of planning and monitoring that thinking process. I think a really huge one when it comes to metacognitive strategies for writing would be knowing how to use a range of resources to support your writing. So by that range of resources, that might be the teacher's live modelling. It might be resources on the working rules, such as scaffolds and vocabulary banks. It might be drawing upon a mentor text. it might be drawing on previous learning in your book, so turning back to a previous lesson and drawing on that too. And I think linked to that is having that range of strategies to kind of help yourself find a way through when you get stuck in a piece of writing as well, and knowing how you can use those resources to help yourself to get unstuck. And then I think a final sort of key metacognitive strategy here to touch upon would also be editing. Editing's always sort of a huge beast in itself, and there is so much to metacognition when it comes to editing. But we know that that specific feedback to improve writing is such an important part of developing writers. And we know that effective feedback doesn't just improve the writing as a task, it actually develops the writer in terms of them understanding and evaluating which strategies supported them to be successful in their writing and which strategies they need to develop moving forward as well. So that sort of real rigor and meaningful approach when it comes to editing. So that's sort of an overview. It's definitely not a comprehensive list, but it's an overview of some key metacognitive strategies when it comes to writing. And I think the reason that we're so interested in these metacognitive strategies is that through our observations and experiences of working with schools with this real specific focus on writing, we have found that these strategies can quite easily be overlooked, actually, in terms of like the attention paid to them when it comes to explicit teaching and developing these strategies for pupils. And this is something we've noticed through being in schools ourselves and having countless conversations with teachers. When we're having those conversations and teachers are saying to me things like children just, they just don't know how to draw upon the model, or where they might be commenting and saying things like pupils just get that real fear when they open their book and they've got to get writing. And even though they've got a plan that they have completed, they still don't quite know how to turn that plan into a piece of writing on the page in front of them. So we're almost on a bit of a mission to really delve into these metacognitive strategies in writing and to think about how important they are for developing children as writers in primary school. So that's a bit of an overview, high-level overview of what we're meaning when we're talking about metacognitive strategies, specifically in writing at primary.
What I really like is that it's really concrete. These are terms that we can use as teachers and in classrooms to support pupils in developing certain approaches. I think probably, obviously you guys have been in the game for a while. We would have called this independence back in the day, but unhelpfully so, because, well, what does that really mean? But, that pupil's a bit more independent. Well, actually, that pupil's able to utilize the tools and strategies you just described, Jen. So I think what I really like about that definition is that it allows us to work with it, because my worry with metacognition when it first sort of came out was that it was a bit of a buzzword and it didn't really mean anything. But actually what you've described means a lot, and actually I can see how that could be really helpful for teachers.
Yeah, it's funny, metacognition can feel like something that's quite opaque and inaccessible, and it can feel like a bit of a scary word sometimes if you haven't spent the time looking into it and doing the research around it. And I think you're right that actually sometimes, not just within writing, but I'm sure you find the same within maths and within other subjects, once we start speaking about those metacognitive strategies, and as a teacher you're able to hear those concrete examples and think about, oh, actually that is something that I already do in my classroom, or that isn't something I do at the moment, but something that I can see that my children definitely need. So I think there is, this need to demystify metacognition a little bit and make it that bit more concrete and accessible to teachers.
Absolutely, and I can see, especially with the blank page and writer's block, I think I can see how that'd be really, really powerful. Why is it worth, we started to branch into this, why is it worth spending time on this in the classroom?
I might jump in here, Kieran. I think metacognition can fundamentally change writing for pupils. Writing should be a means of communication, ultimately, allowing pupils to express themselves, their thoughts, their opinions, their ideas through the written word, for a range of varied, purposes and audiences. And as educators, we would want this to feel like a really intentional and purposeful process. Something that pupils can achieve, that's achievable, and that can help them achieve something, whatever that is. It might be aiming to make their audience laugh, entertain their audience, inform their audience of something important. Whatever their purpose, we want this process to be something intentional for pupils. But we know, that for a lot of pupils, writing might feel like a box ticking exercise where they're cramming in as many features or aspects in their writing to get another piece of writing done and completed. So it can become very product orientated and focused rather than process orientated. And I think, metacognitive strategies shine a spotlight on the process of writing, and developing the writer rather than a single piece of writing. Writing is learning to write, I guess, is a journey. And I get, and many writers will agree that it's a lifelong journey at that. And also, metacognitive strategies can really support and have significant impact on people's confidence and their motivation. For a pupil who might be struggling with writing, the overwhelming feeling might be that writing is something that's largely mysterious and overwhelming, and not that they know that they're finding it difficult, but then the harder layer there as well is not knowing why they're finding it difficult. They might be asking themselves questions like, why is my sentence not making sense? Why are my paragraphs or my section of writing not coherent or cohesive? Why is my writing ultimately not having the impact that I thought it might have on my audience? And I think, metacognitive strategies help writing become more transparent, more accessible, and help people get a sense of control over that process. I really love Jennifer Webb's book, the Metacognition Handbook. And I know I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but I love this analogy. She said it's like learning to drive your own brain, which I thought was a really helpful analogy there. So it's about helping people get control of that writing process. And we know that there is also a strong link between confidence and motivation. We know that past success and experiences of success will ultimately develop a pupil's motivation if they feel they're more likely to be successful the next time round. So that's really important. And if you repeatedly experience something as difficult, mysterious, confusing, unpredictable, even you're less likely to invest effort in that task, in that learning in the future. And a lot of pupils will start to internalize that belief that I'm not a good writer, but I'm not a writer. And conversely, if you have those experiences of success through having a range of metacognitive strategies, you're more likely to feel more motivated to write in the future. And conversely, you're more likely to internalize that idea that I am a good writer and that I am a writer. So, we're getting into, I think, self-regulation here, which is also a big part of metacognition. But, a self-regulated writer is someone that's aware and can manage their motivation and their thoughts and their learning and writing behaviors.
Reluctance in writing is a very special kind of beast, isn't it? Whenever people decides to opt out, I think across most of the curriculum, it manifests in a certain way, but in writing, I think it's particularly frustrating, both for probably the learner and the teacher. And so this awareness of your capacity and that like I say, and the idea that success allows your self-perception to develop, I think that's crucial, because then
Absolutely.
Because students are starting to identify as writers, then they become writers because they're writing more, just like we're reading more, just like we're doing more maths, the more you do it, the better you're likely to get. What strategies could be used to develop pupil metacognitive thinking in writing? And maybe there may be different elements to this when we think of a different pupil. So almost like if I've got the pupil who is looking at the page and doesn't want to write, is that strategy different from the pupil who is writing but perhaps doesn't have awareness of that they're just churning out 7 pages of, repetition, they're writing for the sake of a kind of thing. I don't know. Is there a distinction to be drawn, or is it just a journey in general?
I think it's a bit of both. I think, that knowledge and that understanding of your pupils as individuals and as writers, obviously can certainly guide what you want to prioritise in terms of teaching metacognitive strategies. But at the same time, I would say that our first step as teachers and as schools is just to explicitly teach those strategies full stop. And I would say that's really where we want to begin here. Because I think at the moment, sometimes it's easy to make assumptions about the metacognitive strategies that you want children to have in your class. And so we might have conversations where teachers might say, and I've definitely said myself, you know, children, they don't know how to use the plan, or they don't know how to draw upon the model, or they can't come up with ideas. And I think there's a little bit of reframing for us to do here within primary writing, where instead of saying they don't know how to, we say, well, they haven't been taught to. So they haven't been taught how to draw upon the model, or they haven't been taught how to use their plan to craft a piece of writing. And that is our responsibility in primary education, to explicitly teach those metacognitive strategies. And so I would say number one is actually for us just to explicitly teach those strategies. And as part of those, process, obviously we will be modelling the strategies and then providing ample opportunities for practice and for feedback as well. And then I think linked to that, some work that we're doing at Illuminating and something we've been working on with a couple of schools as well, is actually thinking really deeply about those metacognitive strategies and what progression of those might look like throughout a child's time at primary school. So with one school, we've just been thinking about that specifically within the strand of planning when we think about the writing process. So when we mention the writing process, we tend to use the one that is set out in the writing framework of planning, drafting, revising, editing and sharing. So that's that sort of 5-stage process. So with one school, we've just been really focusing on what are the metacognitive strategies that we want children to develop in the planning stage of the writing process from year 1 all the way up to year 6. So first of all, just thinking about sort of year 1, key stage 1. In year 1, we want children to be able to plan their writing through talk, through play, through drama and through pictures. And that's that for year 1, okay? And then we move into year 2. And then we think, right, now we're in year 2, we might have children to start to bring some words and phrases into their planning for writing. And then as we move into year 3 and 4, then we start to think about children start to be able to plan in note form and actually explicitly teaching how to plan in note form. And then as we get up into year 5 and 6, teaching children how to use a range of organisational devices, so such as bullet points, to plan in note form as well. So there's something there about being really specific and intentional in terms of sort of breaking down and mapping out the metacognitive strategies that you want to teach to pupils in each year group. Because the more that you specify and sequence those strategies, the easier it makes for you as a teacher to be able to explicitly teach them. So I think another example within that I mentioned earlier is that using a range of resources to support your writing. So in key stage 1, that might look like using a common exception word resource. It might look like using a letter formation sort of resource of some kind, perhaps a phonics resource. It might be using the teacher model to a certain extent, and then perhaps some scaffolds from the working wall. And that really is probably enough for key stage 1, because if you think about our 5, 6 and 7-year-olds who are mastering the fundamentals of transcription and composition, any more than that is likely to be quite cognitively overloading actually. And then as we move into years 3 and 4, we might think about other resources we want children to draw on. So perhaps by year 3 and 4, we are at a stage where we can teach them how to draw upon a mental text. Perhaps we can also teach them to draw upon their learning from earlier on in the sequence, so a child can sort of flick back in their book to 2 pages and go, oh, right, brilliant, I'm going to use some of those relative clauses in my writing today. And then as we get into year 5 and 6, it may be that children can draw upon learning not just from that sequence, but actually from a previous sequence. So they might be writing a story where they're building suspense, and they think, well, wait a minute, in September we did some work around building suspense, so I'm going to turn back. Brilliant, I've got some devices for building suspense here. I'm going to see if I can bring some of those across. Or it might even be how a child can draw upon wider literature to support them during the drafting process. So perhaps they're writing an action story and they're thinking, do you know what, I read a brilliant action book, it's over in the book corner, I'm going to go and grab that and turn to this chapter, and that's going to support me with that writing. But again, it's being really intentional thinking about during the drafting process in terms of drawing upon a range of resources to support my writing, what do we want that to actually look like in each year group? And once we've specified and sequenced that, then it makes it easier for us to explicitly teach that and those strategies and provide those opportunities for practice and feedback. So I've talked there at quite like a high level, a whole school kind of picture level. I think if you're a teacher and you're thinking, but what does this mean for me in my classroom tomorrow? Where do I start with this? You might just take one metacognitive strategy and start thinking about, how do I explicitly teach this? And how do I provide those opportunities for practice and feedback? So a classic one that always comes up in conversations with teachers and in training, one that we've experienced ourselves, is around the children struggling to know how to draw on the models, to craft their own independent piece of writing. You tend to get children who struggle with this falling into two camps here. You get children who don't use the model at all, and then you get the children who just copy the model, and they might swap in and out kind of one adjective from time to time. And quite often, a key reason for that is that we haven't actually explicitly taught children how to draw upon a model to craft a piece of writing. So that might look like actually getting a model of writing up on the interactive whiteboard, for you as a teacher, getting your flip chart out and actually really demonstrating a process to children of how I'm going to draw upon certain features of language and certain structural features from this model to craft my own piece of writing, bringing in my own ideas and my own words and bringing in my own sentence structures as well. And as you're doing that, sharing that thinking process out loud really explicitly for pupils, so that they're more likely to be able to replicate that thinking process, that metacognitive thinking process. So I think that real focus on explicit teaching, practice and feedback is so important, and that's often what's missing here. And as I say, you might be thinking about that at a whole school key stage or at a class level. But then I think, linked back to what you said earlier, there will also be pupils in your class who will benefit from different focuses on different strategies when it comes to developing those metacognitive strategies. Because as you said, you might have the writer who rushes ahead and gets loads and loads of words down on the page, but perhaps needs some real support with ensuring that their writing is coherent and cohesive. So that's where your focus might be for that child. But you might also have a child who is the opposite and just struggles to get words down, struggles to get started with their writing in the first place. So for that child, it might be far more about, how do I use my plan to get started with a piece of writing? So I think that there are generic, universal sort of metacognitive strategies that can help all writers. But within that, you're likely to have different priorities based upon your knowledge of the pupils as writers as well. So yeah, that would be the whole the sort of big picture that I would give there in terms of where you might start with that.
I think you've done well to give the teacher who wants to try this out tomorrow or improve this in their own practice some guidance. But like, what's immediately apparent is how complicated this is and how whole school in nature this is. You know, this is a literacy lead thinking about, what does this look like across the school? Because, you know, there's only so much one person can do. And if, you know, there are ways to develop this right from nursery through to 6 and obviously beyond, that's a unified journey, or a coherent journey that needs to be told or needs to be developed across the school, you know. So, you know, I think that there's a limit to what we can do in the classroom. Obviously, we can develop these in our students, but you're good, you know, if everyone's working on this together, they're probably getting a whole lot more from it as a school. Is that your experience whenever you're in schools working on this kind of thing?
Completely agree. I would say that's almost the ideal, isn't it? That whole school sequential picture of progression. But we know that this is, even the kind of idea of metacognition, metacognitive strategies in writing, is something that is still fairly new to us, I would say, kind of in primary English and with a lot of schools as well. And so you've got a lot of schools who are at the much earlier stages with this, and it might just be that bit of thinking at an individual class level. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Donny?
Yeah, and I think it's about just reflecting as well what that looks like from year group to year group, and how you can explicitly teach and model those strategies. And, you know, and we're doing a lot of thinking around that in terms of, well, what does metacognition writing look like in year one? And then, of course, you want those strategies to continue. You don't want them just to stop when children move up to year two. Right then, where we take that, and then how do we develop that again in year two, in the planning stage, in the drafting stage, in the editing stage as well. So I think that's really important to have a really clear, intentional idea of that process and how it evolves from year 1 to year 6.
Yeah, so there's almost the ideal with what you would want, but then there's also what might be more realistic for where an individual teacher or an English lead might be at the moment. When, as we know, you spoke at the beginning of this about English being such a large subject, and we know that English leads are contending often with many priorities, and there are so many aspects, so many elements to the subject of English, and this is one specific area of writing that we're speaking about. So I think for us, it's about trying to bring this to the forefront of teachers and leaders' minds a little bit more, so that we're shifting the conversation and people are talking more about it and realizing how important those strategies are. And then, yes, ideally moving towards that little bit more rigor in terms of thinking about how we might sequence and break down those metacognitive strategies over time.
Yeah, and maybe as well as about getting pupils to talk about not just the work that they've completed in writing, but how they completed it. Those children that are successful at writing, what strategies are they using, what's working for them, so that they're sharing that and modeling that behavior and that writing behavior as much as having the final published piece of writing on the wall as well.
There will be people listening, right? Because I think, especially literacy, it's thinking, "Oh, the clarity with which you're both speaking is really interesting." But then, as you've gone on, I think they're thinking, "Okay, this is something I want to develop in my school. How do they get in touch with you guys?" I was going to do this at the end, but actually, I think now they'll probably be listening to this bit and going, "I want to get in touch with them right now." What are they doing? Are they go to your website, or are they emailing you, or what's the plan?
Right, yeah. Well, we've got our website up, www.luminaryLiteracy.co.uk. So that's the first port of call. And from there you can get in touch. We've got our email there as well. So, and if you want to find out more about us, you can see our sort of principles, our approach to both consultancy, literacy consultancy, but also on how we're developing our own writing curriculum and our own writing pedagogy.
And we're on LinkedIn as well, so you can just reach out to us on LinkedIn and give us a bit of a shout out on there. We are the type of people who will just talk about primary writing all day long. So we're very happy for anybody to get in touch and even just, to have a conversation kind of about this moving forward, because we're still very much on this journey ourselves of delving into metacognition in primary writing, what effective practice within this looks like. Very interested to hear from or have any further conversations.
Are there any pitfalls that we should be keen to avoid when we're establishing our approach to the teaching and utilization of metacognitive strategies within writing?
Yeah, I think probably a classic pitfall would be trying to do too much and do it too soon. If I put it in a nutshell, I think a big bit of our advice, from a conversation today would be, start small. And give it time, we're thinking long term for this. And Jen spoke about the process of writing, those aspects of writing, from planning, drafting, revising, and editing. So maybe it's starting with, and this could be a whole school approach, starting with one of those aspects, right? So we're going to focus in as a school on the metacognitive strategies around writing, and we're going to approach this strategically. I could imagine a really great staff meeting where teachers are encouraged to ask themselves questions like, what do these metacognitive strategies that support planning of writing look like in my year group, for my children and in my class? What does it look like to model these strategies and to explicitly teach these strategies? So I think focusing on one aspect and trying to implement that first, having a shared language, a shared understanding across the school is probably a really, really good place to start. Another pitfall that just comes to mind is, and I think this is a pitfall that can come with talking about metacognition in any subject, is that you're sort of seeing it as something separate, seeing it as something, as an add-on to the curriculum, something that's separate to the curriculum. And I think it's important to remember that metacognitive strategies are something that has to be developed in context, and they should not stand separately from a subject, but permeate that subject, just part of the practice of that subject. yeah, rather than being an add-on. And I think there might be a temptation to have, say, a metacognition time where children might think generically about the metacognition skills they use in learning generally. Perhaps this might involve them doing, a generic worksheet or task. And I think that might actually be a pitfall, because I think metacognitive strategies are, like, intimately intertwined with the specific subject they're related to, and of course, there will be overlaps, and things that are similar in different subjects, but metacognitive strategies that work in writing won't be exactly the same as the strategies that work in science or PE or maths, So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that they've got to permeate the subject and be intertwined with the planning and the pedagogy of that subject. And in terms of the time frames, I think when we're working in schools, it's that pressure to get quick results, and in terms of the cycle of time in terms and in the school year. And I think it's important to remember that this is a long-term strategy. We're really supporting pupils to be lifelong learners, lifelong writers. As adults, we're still learning about ourselves as learners as we take on different challenges and our own metacognitive strategies that work. And actually, some pupils in some professions might be still in education well up until their late 20s and 30s, depending on the profession. So it's taking that long-term view and ensuring that we are remembering equipping pupils for lifelong learning and hopefully lifelong writing.
I think that's really powerful, particularly the idea of, I can see us bolting things on, and I can, and if you do that, you've missed the point of what you guys have been saying today, because it's very clear that there's an intimate relationship between the behavior of being a writer and thinking about those behaviors as a means to improving and perpetuating, almost like fueling future writing. So, so I think, but I can totally see that. I can see I can see how, as a profession, we love to do those things. And then
we love a worksheet.
But actually, if it's connected directly to some particular part of your practice or your behavior in writing, it's going to be much, much more powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if we're thinking of that, as a whole school approach, that might be involving different subject leads and thinking what metacognition means for that subject as well.
And I mean, and when I say I'm skeptical or I'm worried about metacognition being a buzzword, it's those kind of things that worry me. Are we putting enough thought into this? Actually, I'm really pleased that we've spoken about this at length, because it gives me hope that actually there are a lot of sensible conversations happening about metacognition and metacognitive thinking in writing. Because we don't want this extra work for the sake of it, but what you're describing is actually is something I wish I was cognizant of myself when I was teaching writing. I don't like Chris Such's work in reading. I wish that had been on the table whenever I was teaching. I'm teaching so many kids in a really ineffective way, basically.
And it's funny that you say that. We've had conversations where we've said, well, this is exactly what we did, or that we've had experience of. So as I said, we're kind of on that learning journey ourselves. And so a classic one for myself was, teaching Key Stage 1. I would quite often get children to plan their writing in Key Stage 1 through words and phrases when they were still very much the early stage of developing their transcriptional skills. And then sometimes going from planning to drafting would almost be children writing out a story and then writing out the exact same story afterwards. So even things sort of such as realizing that actually, where children are at those early stages of transcription, the best way for them to plan their writing isn't through writing, it is through drama and talking and through play as well. So as I said, it's been a journey for us, a journey of reflection for us to kind of look back on what we've done ourselves as practitioners and our strategies that we've used previously, and to think about how we might shift our practice moving forward as well.
See, you mentioned LinkedIn, and I'm growing a bit disillusioned with social media in general. But I like the idea of I'm going to keep my LinkedIn, because I want somewhere for people who aren't in touch with me already to get in touch with me, to DM me, that kind of thing. But I am going to try and revive. I don't know if you guys have heard of Discord. We've got a TADAPE Discord where basically there's a group of really motivated teachers having conversations. I want to try and revive it a bit. So this is unprepared. I'm going to ask you a question. Listeners are going to hear the question, and then they're going to cut to the end of the episode. But then if you go to the Discord, there'll be a video of your answer to this question. And so, because I think there was a scramble to say that the writing framework is what we've been doing all along for some groups, when that's not necessarily the case. But actually, I think a lot of what you've described to me, and I'm just knowing your work in general, sounds like your work is really complemented because you're already engaged with the research into effective writing. But is there anything you've learned from reading the writing framework that has thought, actually, this is really going to change the direction of travel for me or my practice in general? And I'm not expecting it to be a massive step because, like I said, I think you're already on the same page as the writing framework. But is there anything that you've taken away? And I think keen listeners will be really interested to know what your thinking is on that. And so, yeah. Any thoughts?
Should we leave a dramatic pause here?
Well, what I might do is, you put the future music in. It goes,
yes.
In Wade's world, that's what's going to happen here. And then fantastic. I mean, it has been absolutely lovely. I think this is going to be massively useful, really, really clear, really, really focused. And so I really appreciate that. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having us on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kieran, and we hope to see you again soon.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.